All right, our second speaker in this session is J.D. Vandenberg, who is going to speak on a survey on 3D lookup table performance in 10-bit HDR Rec 2020. J.D. is an electrical engineer, mathematician, and an imaging and color science engineer. He has worked previously for ARRI and Technicolor before moving recently to the Walt Disney Studios as the Disney Motion Picture Production Imaging and Color Science Engineer. At Disney, he supports cross-studio production and investigates next-generation displays, camera systems, and cutting-edge production technologies. So please welcome J.D.
Right. Thank you for the introduction, David. So yes, in this talk, we're going to talk about 3D-LUTs, specifically in the cinematic world, which is my world, and scripted TV. And really, the question that I'm going to try to answer, or I'm investigating, is what is the appropriate size for 3D-LUT? I first to read a disclaimer that this research was conducted outside of my work at the Walt Disney Studios, and the views and opinions expressed in this presentation and the subsequent paper are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the employers. That's what you get when you work for Walt Disney, I guess. So what is really a 3D-LUT? So a 3D-LUT is a function that takes really a triplet RGB coloring and spits out a color out. You can see it as a black box. If you have a 10-bit video signal, you have then a billion, so 10 to the power of 2 to the power of 10 to the power of 3, you have a billion colors, and so then this 3D-LUT needs to have a billion entries, and each of those entries needs to hold a color, which is the color output, which will be in 10-bit, 30-bit value. So you end up with a file that's about 4 gigabytes. Now, you have to parse through that file, and if you have a UHD signal that runs at 30 frames per second, then you have to go through that 4 gigabyte file, 250 million times a second. So that's a little much even for our computer hardware today. So how do we go around it? Well, the easiest way to simplify this is to actually use a sparse 3D-LUT. So a 3D-LUT that actually jumps over some of those values. So this is a simplified version of a 3D-LUT because this is a 4 by 4 by 4 3D-LUT. You can see the origin is, in case of 10-bit, 000, and at the tip of the cube you have the 1023, 1023, 1023. The colors are only stored at the vertices, and if you want to recover a color, and if you're unlucky, and that's most of the time, your color doesn't land on a vertex, then you have to use interpolation. First step is to identify in which subcube the point is. Once you've done that, you extract those 8 values living on the vertices, and you use that for interpolation. So in this paper, I studied with my co-author. I forgot to mention it, I'm very sorry. Stefano Andriani, who cannot be with us. I'm sorry. Okay, let me go back. Okay, so we studied 4 interpolation schemes: Trilinear, Prism, Pyramidal, and Tetrahedral. So I'm going to go over very quickly because I don't have a lot of time. But basically, Trilinear Interpolation, the way it works is that you choose your axis. You don't have to pick a certain order. In this case, let's start with the blue axis. And using the 8 values at the vertices, you derive the value at those 4 blue points. From those 4 blue points, you do another linear or 2 linear interpolation to calculate the values at the grid points, and then you do a final interpolation between the green points to find the value at the point that you are looking for. If you are using the Prism interpolation, then you actually slice the subcube into 2 prisms of equal volume. So now you have an extra step, so that you have to do a test to see in which of those 2 prisms your point belongs to. So you have to find a subcube, and then in the subcube find which of the 2 prisms. And after that, you do an interpolation from only the 6 vertices that you keep. You actually discard 2 of them. If you use the pyramidal interpolation, in this case, you divide the cube into 3 pyramids, and now you have 2 tests to perform to find out in which of those 3 pyramids your point belongs to. And now the interpolation is limited to 5 points. And finally, if you use tetrahedral, you slice the cube into 6 tetrahedrals, I like to use tetrahedra, and you have to do even a little more, 2.5 on average tests to find out from which of those 6 tetrahedra your point belongs to. Once you have done that, you do an interpolation with only the 4, from the value stored at only those 4 vertices. So these are the tests that you have to perform. Now let's talk about color difference metric. Again, I don't need to spend too much time on this, but in the SDR world, CDIE 2000 is kind of the reference right now to calculate the color difference between 2 points. It's based off the LAB color space. It has a few more parameters to compensate for lack of uniformity, and you enter your 2 points and you get a color difference. It is not suited really for HDR, at least not this version, and because it was really developed from a set of images that was SDR. So as we talked a little bit earlier, for HDR, a very good color difference metric is delta ICTCP, which is come straight from the Dolby ICTCP color space. To note that this is valid, at least again, this version, with when you use the PQ EOTF only. So I limited my study of BT.2100 to PQ only. It's a brand new metric, and there are more metric coming up and under development. All right, so how was the testing procedure? Basically, we got a hold of a few 3D-LUTs. The best was when we could find a parametric 3D-LUT, which is not very common. And we were applying it to an image. From that parametric 3D-LUT, we would derive a small version, a small 3D-LUT. We will apply it to that image too. And then we would do a pixel-wise delta E2000 for SDR or delta ICTCP difference calculation. So you end up with as many of those color differences as you have pixel in the image. And after that, you calculate the mean, the maximum, the minimum, the standard deviation. And from that, you find the best possible formula to calculate your J and D. So if you don't have access to a parametric LUT, we got access to a very large LUT, 127 cube, that we derived a smaller 3D LUT from. And it turned out that we calculated the difference with coming from a parametric, and the error was small enough that we could accept this approach. So, J&D calculation. If we were to use the mean of all of these delta E or delta ICTCP, then it means that basically half of the image would be above that, and that would not be acceptable. However, if we use the max of those delta ICTCP or delta E, it means that you only consider the pixel in all the image that has the worst, the highest error. And that would be a little overkill too. So we observed the distribution of the error. We found that it looked pretty close to a normal distribution. We picked M equal 3, which ensured that you should cover 99.74% of all your values. And we actually measured that on all our images, and it was roughly about 1%. So we decided to accept that 1% of the pixel will be outside our calculation, considered outliers. And we call this trade-off mean-3 STD, standard. So ARRI gave us a set of images that was captured with their camera. Those images are LogC. And we have like a very good range of different shooting scenarios. You have the ARRI Academy in Munich. You have some foliage, you have some skin tones. You have the Oktoberfest that we're all waiting for in green and blue screen. Jay-Z has a big smile on his face. You have also a sharpness chart. You have the beach. We had more like a sky. And pay attention to the last four, Alexei left girl, Munich Odeonplatz, and colored balls and colored indoors, because the first two are dark images, and the last two are actually highly saturated. And that's going to produce some interesting results. So just for reference, the list of the images, the cameras that they use to capture those, exposure index, white balance, and the type of images. As I mentioned, the two darks and two saturated index. Actually, the skin tone is also dark, kind of dark with the background. So we first tested our approach on Rec 79 SDR. So we got from ARRI a LogC to Rec 79, very large 3D-LUT, 127 cube. We tested all the interpolation schemes that I mentioned just earlier, Trilinear, Tetrahedral, Prism, and Pyramidal. The images were, had a bit depth reduced to 10-bit, and we started our analysis. So this is the first part of the result. So let me try to explain. The y-axis is all the different sizes of 3D cube LUT, of the different size of 3D LUTs that we compare to the high resolution 3D LUT, or so later parametric 3D LUT. And the vertical is the delta E2000 error. Again, if we consider just the mean, as I said earlier, well, everything is under the GND threshold, which is 1. If we consider the max, everything is above. And if we consider our metric, which is mean plus 3 standard deviation, then we see that we have a nice crossing. I have some notes here. Tetrahedral, which is green, crosses the GND at with a cube size of 26 cube. Pyramid 28 cube, Prism 32 cube, and Trilinear 33 cube. That was the Munich Art Academy image. For the colored balls, same behavior. The mean below the GND, max always above the GND, and mean plus 3 times standard deviation. We had a cross tetrahedral at 31 cube, pyramidal 38, prism 39, and trilinear 41. Now let's put everything into one graph. Whoa. Okay. So these are all the images that we have tested. You have pyramidal interpolation on the left, prism interpolation on the right. They are pretty similar in terms of error production. There is a slight advantage to the pyramidal because, interestingly, it uses less vertices. But what's very even more interesting is when we go to trilinear compared to trilinear and tetrahedral. And you can see that there's really a shift between those two on the point where they cross the GND threshold. For trilinear, it happens roughly between 25 and 40, and for tetrahedral, between 18 and 31. So it's actually a 30% size reduction for tetrahedral to achieve the same error. I put that as a bar graph that maybe you can see it a little better. Green is tetrahedral and yellow is trilinear. And the second line, I think you can see it, is the maximum of all of the tested image. And for the maximum trilinear, we get 41 cube, and for tetrahedral, 31 cube. So it's a 32% difference between the two interpolation schemes. Now let's move on to HDR. So now that we have validated this approach, we have moved on to HDR. And again, we received from ARRI a large 3D-LUT, 127 cube, that is going from LogC to Rec 2020 PQ in 12-bit this time. We tried the same interpolation schemes and, as I said, on a 12-bit image. So same image is tested. The mean plunges very quickly under the GND. The maximum always stays above. And the mean plus 3 standard deviation crosses at 32Q for tetrahedral, 36Q for pyramidal, 41Q for trilinear, and Prism crosses at 43Q. For the colored balls, there's something really interesting happening, because you can see that suddenly you need a much bigger 3D-LUT to go beyond the JND threshold. As I said, it's a saturated image. So in this case, tetrahedral requires 77 cube 3D-LUT, pyramidal 87, Prism 96, and trilinear a 97 cube 3D-LUT. Put everything together once again, and we can see that there are actually clusters happening. And this is pyramidal interpolation and prism interpolation. Again, kind of similar results, but with trilinear and tetrahedral, we have a significant shift. And we can see also that these are actually divided, especially in the trilinear, into 3 different types of images. It's more 2 in the tetrahedral, and it turns out that the images here are actually the saturated colors and the dark colors. And they need a much larger 3D-LUT to be able to produce unnoticeable errors. So once we put everything into this bar graph, again, you can see those 4 images here. And the skin tone, which is also dark because of the dark background, is also requiring a much larger 3D-LUT. If we exclude those just to look at non-dark or saturated images, we require then a 3D-LUT. Let me see, I'm sorry about that. 72 cube recommended for trilinear interpolation and 55 cube for tetrahedral. Now, we try this approach again with more 3D-LUT, this time parametric 3D-LUTs that was provided by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Science from the ACES version 1.1. So the IDT was going from LogC to ACES, and the RTODT was going from ACES to REC 2020 PQ. We tried all of them. This time we limited ourselves to tetrahedral because we have shown that they beat all other interpolation like really every time, and we're in 12-bit again. And in this case, we can see that the dark images are also requiring a larger 3D-LUT, same as the skin tone, really way above 100. And for the rest, we had require, I'm sorry, let me look at the numbers, about 61 cube to enable to achieve a 3D-LUT that doesn't create interpolation errors. Now, finally, we went from 12-bit to 10-bit. And it's important to notice and to say that going just from 12-bit to 10-bit by itself introduces an error, of course. We have measured that in HDR, it produced an error of an average, a mean of about 0.32, delta ICTCP of about 0.32, and the maximum of 0.84. So it means that if we can bump into some images, creating a lot of very sensitive to interpolation error that could be just by itself going from 12 to 10-bit above our metric, meaning that creating visual errors. And so here is my final graph, when you can see the required size of 3D-LUT between 10 and 12-bit. And on average, you need a 3D-LUT that's about 50% larger working in 10-bit than if you were to work in 12-bit. Just that. So conclusions, we defined a metric called, that we call mean 3 standard, that we found appropriate to define for the JND threshold. It covers 99% of the pixel in the image while leaving a few outliers out. The tetrahedral interpolation of all the 4 interpolation schemes studied outperforms all of them in almost every single case in both SDR and HDR. Tetrahedral require, on average, a LUT that is 20 to 30% smaller than if using trilinear. And trilinear introduced the largest error of the 4 interpolation schemes studied. The color for difference for HDR, there are more metrics being studied currently. According to data ICTCP, you have a dark or highly saturated images, you need a much bigger 3D LUT. When you work in 10-bit SDR, again with trilinear, you should use, actually, according to our test images, a 3D LUT of size 41 cube at least, and 31 cube if you use tetrahedral. 12-bit HDR 72 cube using trilinear, or 55 cube using tetrahedral. And when you want to use 10-bit signal or images, you should expect to use a 3D LUT that is 50% larger than the one you would use for 12-bit. So what's next? I'd like to test more images, more 3D LUTs when they are available. It's not that easy to find. And more color difference formula when they are becoming available, and test more interpolation schemes. Thank you. Bill, any question? I would have been offended.
Good presentation. Just to clear up, I assume that whatever the output of the 3D LUT was, it's brought back into ICTP color space with a conversion. So when you're going to Rec 709 before you do the delta, that you do
Absolutely.
that. And so we're converting the same thing. The other thing that's interesting, you're talking about 12-bit processing for the LUT engine, or are you talking about just sources?
Sources only.
In the color process, or where the LUT's processed, what's the bit depth there, or was it done?
So everything was processed in Python. So everything was written in Python. So the processing itself was in float. I didn't go to the possible hardware limitation of integer and FPGA implementation. So that's a good point. So interpolation-wise, it was in float. The images were provided as 16-bit, but they were reduced artificially to 12 and 10-bit, and then processed through.
Internal interpolation and all the processing was in float as it should be. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And
just for your information,
Yes.
we support the tetrahedral any size in the new 2018 color front. So test away.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Hi, good presentation, Lars
Thank you.
Borg. One concern I have, you're ignoring 1% of the color errors.
Of the pixels.
Of the pixels, yes. My concern would be, how do you present that to customers? Say, well, 1% of your colors will not meet these conversion error criteria. I'm a bit concerned. I would rather have used the max and fit to the max, but I don't mean a huge LUT. But I want to have 12-bit in, going through my LUT and coming back as 12-bit and exactly the same values, and then no one can complain that there are errors. So where did your 1% pixel errors fall? Was there in a certain part of the color space?
Right.
Like
so,
darker colors, lighter colors, saturated colors? And you know, it's like if they all came in one particular area, there would be a visible error. So that's why it's important that they are spread out. So what were the metrics for the
So yeah, that's a good point. I should have looked at the distribution, because one pixel everywhere is not that important. Cluster, which might happen, might be a little more problematic. But you know, it's just a recommendation. What we've done, and I think I just jumped over it a little too quickly, but the whole idea of Rec 709 validation is that we knew that the industry was satisfied with a 33 cube or 32 or 33 cube LUT, which has been used over and over for years. So we know that by experience, it's accepted.
You
And
cannot,
so,
you cannot use that as a error what is the acceptable level of error?
exactly.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Because unfortunately, we have to have a trade-off. Because in a perfect world, I would use, you know, a 200 cube LUT, and nobody would ever complain. But this is not really possible. And hardware-wise, it's even more difficult because even though some manufacturers are offering trilinear, not all. It's creeping. Some more times. Not all. It's very challenging to work with bigger 3D-LUT in a package that can be used on set, for instance, or in camera. So, and by the way, and it's been talked earlier before, there's many other approaches that are very interesting to split with a 1D LUT before, when you can do actually a shaper LUT and then a 3D LUT after. I abstracted all this, but there are definitely approaches beyond the interpolation scheme to, that allow optimization and reducing of error. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please tap the like button and also subscribe to our channel to receive notifications when we add new content. For more information about us, please visit SMPTE.org. We'll see you next time.